thanks everyone for being here. We're very excited. One of the reasons why we love these conferences is it gives us the opportunity as analysts to take all the things that we're doing and seeing and examining and looking at and basically build a conference program around that. So that's really what we've done. And to kick things off, what we want to do is an exercise that we went over recently, which is to take all of those things we're looking at and really start to boil those down into 10 main themes. And we've also mapped those themes to the conference program. So Abid and I, over the next 20 minutes or so, are going to roll through these in kind of rapid-fire format in kind of alternating order, and not only a chance to explain the things we're looking at and convey why things are moving the way they are, but also some session recommendations of things you might want to check out over the next 2 days as they map to these themes that we've gone through. So we'd like to get right into it. First, really kind of the overarching theme is connectivity, or what we're calling radical connectivity. We're all carrying smartphones, sensors and chipsets are becoming more accessible as Moore's Law marches on and the Internet of Things looms in the future. So Abid, why don't you tell us a little bit about this theme to kick things off?
So good morning again, everyone. Like Mike mentioned, one of the themes that we're going to be running with in terms of just BI/Kelsey in general going forward is in thinking about how to approach this entire marketplace, what we're calling the local commerce universe, which we'll hear a little bit more from Tom later on today. But in doing that, one of the first themes that came out that our client base as well as our community members have told us about that is a key element is that connectivity itself, the idea of connectivity, has pretty much become ubiquitous at this point. We're at a stage now where consumers are almost completely used to the fact that their mobile device should be able to do everything for them that they would normally be doing on a desktop, save for a few things like actual work. And what we're finding is that there's new types of ways where connectivity is actually taking place. It's not just a matter of having a mobile device anymore. We're going to be moving into new types of thinking when it comes to actual connectivity, including concepts from what we're calling, or not us, but what the world is calling the Internet of Things. And so a couple of sessions that I wanted to point out, we're going to have a really great high-level conversation on a primer for the Internet of Things. A lot of folks have questions about it, and we're going to have a couple of great key players from the industry come and talk to us today at 10 o'clock. And there's also going to be a great conversation a little bit later on today in terms of thinking about the idea of radical connectivity. For this session or for this conference this week, we really want you to start thinking about the stage as a universe from which so many things are connected now and how your organization should be thinking about it in that regard. I know from there, Mike, we're going to be talking about throughout the day or throughout the session, millennials.
Yeah, so millennials very much builds from what you were just saying. So millennials are the first generation to have grown up completely digital. They're very well connected. But I think more importantly, I did the math the other day, and I remember about 5 years ago saying that millennials are a generation we need to watch in terms of their proclivities, their buying behavior, their media consumption patterns, because those things are really shaping the products that are being launched. But what I realized the other day is that's no longer an emerging topic. It's already here. If you do the math, the oldest millennials are now 35 years old, which essentially means they fully occupy that coveted 18 to 34 demographic. So really examining those, examining those proclivities and preferences that I mentioned is more important than ever. And, what are those? We won't get into too much of a sociological discussion, but some of the things that we've examined are that they're largely untrusting of traditional advertising as we know it. So I really attribute that to some of the deterioration we're seeing in things like display ads, particularly in mobile, and leaning more towards things like social native advertising and brand experiences that are more deeply intermeshed into the social fabric and the social graphs and the way those experiences play out. A few examples of that are emerging ad formats such as Facebook newsfeed ads and also Snapchat stories. And these things are more and more becoming localized. So I think that really the underlying point is that the millennial behavior, based on their increasing buying empowerment and presence in the marketplace, is more important to watch now than ever, and of course to build products and content delivery strategies that really take those proclivities and preferences to heart.
And it's also going to be driving against the sort of overall theme, like I've been mentioning earlier, that we are seeing a shift in the way that media is being consumed as well as utilized by consumers themselves. And one of the major themes that we have found within BI Kelsey has been that digital video is ready to take its stage for prime time, especially in regards to local. 3 or 4 major technologies have started to come into play at a maturity level that make it so that you are now able to think about local video all the way from the small business brick and mortar store level to programmatic local video ad buying. And what's happened that we found is that there's been this democratization effect. Small businesses, local businesses, are able to take a device that they purchased from the mall, an iPhone 6 Plus, for example, with super high definition video quality, 4K digital video quality, and produce their own content, and then distribute it across their own networks using YouTube, for example, or Google+. And what that's doing is removing the barrier between the small business and the ability for them to engage with local video to their consumer and their audience base. And so that changes the way that producers, as well as distributors of ad content, are starting to think about how they position themselves with small businesses. And so we're going to have a couple of interesting conversations about this in terms of thinking about what is it the actual mix that's required in order to figure out the content and marketing story for small businesses going into 2016 and then onwards from there.
So you mentioned video production quality and the democratization of things like the iPhone 6s, which shoots 4K video. In addition to that, the ability to distribute that video in different places. And that gets to our next theme here, which is social. Social is very much taking over local for some of the reasons I mentioned before about millennial behavior, but also in a kind of local commerce context. What we're seeing is that according to BI Kelsey's Local Commerce Monitor survey data, Facebook pages are now the most prevalent SMB marketing channel. If you look at Facebook's own data, 45 million SMBs are now active with Facebook pages. And about 2 million of those are paid advertisers. So that's very important. I did the math the other day to realize that given those numbers, Facebook has penetrated the SMB space in terms of number of SMBs, not necessarily in terms of ad dollars, to a greater degree than Google AdWords with those 2 million advertisers. And more they're doing things that aren't just present, such as a page, but we're seeing the emergence of social tools such as messaging as a conduit to communications between customers and local businesses. And that can be in a customer service context, it can be in a customer acquisition context, but the point is we're starting to see a lot of leading indicators overseas, such as in China with WeChat and in Europe with WhatsApp, where these messaging apps are essentially being used to connect buyer and seller at the local level, not just as a social tool for friends to talk to each other. We're seeing that happen stateside already with Facebook and tools like Facebook Messenger. And there are a number of other things we're actually going to hear from in the next session from Kelly Grazadeh at Facebook in our keynote. But moving beyond that, one thing that we're not going to get into too much at this conference because it's even further into the future, but I think it's worth noting and fun to speculate if you look at virtual reality. Facebook, of course, bought Oculus, and there are a lot of ways that's going to basically mold the social graph and the social experiences through more immersive experiences. But more back to the kind of local commerce angles of that, the interesting thing is that there's going to be a lot of opportunity to create more immersive situations around local commerce and consideration cycles for local transactions. So you can picture things like taking a test drive from the comfort of your home in a car, or perhaps checking out a restaurant ambiance or a hotel room. You can imagine a lot of hospitality and travel applications for that. And again, that's further in the future, but interesting to speculate about how social and virtual reality will kind of come into play there. So next up we have local attribution, which is one of the holy grails of local. So Abid, tell us about that.
You know, it's interesting, and just sort of a quick raise of hands before I go into this. How many folks are using like group texting with their colleagues or with their friends?
Or any messaging app.
All right, so there's a few people. Well, who's using WhatsApp? All right, who's using Facebook Messenger on a regular basis? All right, so see what's happening here, and you, I saw you. So what's happening here, and just and this hits against the local attribution story as well, is that text messaging, or messaging in general, is becoming the next social concept, right? I mean, social networking itself, Facebook itself, is turning into much more like a utility concept, and the folks that are now moving into thinking about social going forward are looking at it from a messaging perspective, and what that does is that it puts the consumer back into the mobile mindset, and that's what local attribution is going to be driven by in in 2016 and going forward. And just to sort of put this in sort of layman's terms, when we talk about attribution, what we're talking about is connecting the online and the offline story for a consumer journey. And if you think about it, it's the reason why it's called the Holy Grail is because we've had these two worlds for the longest time. We've had the point of service world where you've got a retailer or a small business conducting their marketing through a street sign and then having receipts to figure out who bought what. And then they've had the online world where you've had all these different campaigns that provide granular details about how a consumer or a potential consumer is driving through the funnel, but there's never been a real good, easy way to connect the two and get true detail and true visibility about an online campaign's efficacy all the way down to an actual purchase. And what we're seeing now is that this is effectively the next battleground when it comes to thinking about local commerce. There's been technology in the last year that's really sort of pushed this, and one of them is beacon technology. We've been watching this technology for the last 24 months, and I'm pretty confident, I know a lot of people aren't, but I'm pretty confident that this is going to be a successful way for brands, retailers, and small businesses to be able to connect the two dots. And we're going to have a couple of different conversations on how this whole entire paradigm shift is making for new conversations within your audience, or within this audience. One of them is going to be related to the revitalization of deals and loyalty under the context of looking at it from a hardware feet on the street perspective, as well as we're going to have a deep dive in the online and offline gap and how that's actually going to be connected tomorrow afternoon. I think that's going to be pretty interesting. And I think that's actually going to take us to what Mike is going to talk about now.
Sure. So we're seeing very much an evolution from ads to action. I like to say the mobile device is a remote control for the physical world. Yeah. And as consumers spend more and more time on mobile, we're moving past what I like to call version 1 of the smartphone era that was really defined by taking a lot of desktop practices and desktop formats such as display ads and putting them on the mobile device. I think we're only really starting to move past that in earnest and building ad units and delivery formats and things that get right to the action. One example of this is over the last 6 months, we've seen this proliferation of buy buttons throughout a lot of popular apps, such as Facebook, such as Pinterest with buyable pins. We see it in Twitter and Instagram, and a lot of social channels are starting to build these higher degrees of actionability and calls to action to do things. Now, we believe that's going to continue, but I think the evolutionary path that's going to take, much going back to Abid's point about things moving offline, are calls to action that don't just go towards an e-commerce play of buying something on your device, but really following the money where the money is, which is offline. If you look at the data, about $7 trillion is spent offline in terms of U.S. consumer spending. E-commerce only represents a few $100 billion, which is about 7% of that total. So in terms of the actionability of all of these different types of content formats that are evolving, we believe that it's going to really start to do things like drive that offline local purchase behavior. So an example of that is a call button to call local businesses. Calls are very much becoming a currency in local. Facebook's already doing this with their call buttons on pages and newsfeed ads. Other buttons that you can imagine in calls to action are things like scheduling and reserving restaurant reservations and things like that. And these are things that actually are not necessarily new. You have companies like Agendize and others that have been working with these types of calls to action for a long time. But we believe we're going to see an inflection point in the deployment and also the use of these very actionable things. And again, it moves beyond a discussion in mobile we've been having that's dominated things, which I believe is the wrong discussion, which is about ad targeting and how well we're targeting ads and measuring ads. Really getting more to the actual action, I think, is important. And, it's really compressing what is otherwise or relatively a convoluted customer journey of doing a search and then getting 10 links and then drilling down and then reading reviews and then perhaps calling a business. Compressing that into just one button in a lot of cases, given that high degree of immediacy and intent of mobile users, is something we're really going to start to see continue, and we're only seeing the beginning of it right now. So programmatic, tell us a little bit about that, Abid.
And this goes back into the same sort of thinking here, which is programmatic 2-3 years ago was something that I know myself and I know the folks in this room probably didn't think as being a directly applicable concept for our audience, the local businesses, the multi-location, and the SMBs. But what's happened in the last 18 months and probably going into the next 18 as well is that we've seen a proliferation of programmatic type thinking as well as programmatic technology being scaled down appropriately and cost efficiently to make it so that small businesses and local businesses are now able to leverage the same sort of targeted and automatic ad buying and selection criteria that comes with programmatic buying for not only display advertising but also for video. And what we're expecting is that this is also going to be a major driver of us having to sort of let go of the worry about advertising in terms of how we're going to plan it and start to move backwards into thinking from a holistic marketing perspective of how do we engage with the folks that we're working with, because half of our job is now becoming automatic. And I think Mike has a bunch to say about apps.
Yeah, so as mobile usage continues to take over a greater share of users' time, things like browser-based experiences and search, for example, are really receding, because if you look at mobile usage patterns, the majority of time spent, it's actually 4 out of 5 minutes spent according to Nielsen, are happening in-app. And that has a lot of important implications for reaching users. It's no longer just about things like SEO, but really app-based strategies, deep linking, a lot of the things we're going to be talking about. And another important question is, companies and leaders that were really positioned well at the browser, such as Google, for example, what are they doing to live in this more app-based world? One of the answers to that question is Google Now, which we're going to be talking about later today. Deep linking is, of course, another important topic. Apps have a lot of advantages in terms of their functional superiority over the mobile web in a lot of cases. But there's also some disadvantages in that they're not as interoperable as the open web is. So the kind of art and the science of deep linking is quickly evolving, and you're probably hearing this term a lot. There are lots of different flavors of it that we're going to unpack in a session later. But the important part is being able to know these access points to mobile and build kind of content delivery strategies accordingly, because that's actually quickly changing. And I talked about social earlier and how that's really taking over local. And we're going to actually hear from Kelly next, Kelly Grazade at Facebook. But Facebook pages are increasingly becoming a replacement for a website for a lot of small businesses. Right. I mentioned the numbers earlier, how they have 45 million pages from SMBs that are active. And that's important to note because I believe they've been able to accelerate to that level because of, first of all, the ease of use, which is, of course, a major success factor when we're talking about SMBs and simplicity. But also there's an interesting thing going on where SMBs are also just regular people. So they have Facebook accounts, and they've become so accustomed to using Facebook. So the logical leap from that to using it as a promotional vehicle and setting up a page for their business is not as great, and the learning curve isn't as steep as what we've seen from some other types of local advertising and marketing and presence products.
Yeah, and, you know, and that shift, again, that paradigm shift that's taking place where the end user as well as the SMB or the local business is starting to think very differently about how they market and how they engage online is also happening behind the scenes in terms of the way that we think about the back-end technology itself. In the past 3 years, we've had these terms. Solo-mo is, thank God, it's gone. It's been gone for a while. But we started to see terms like ad tech and martech start to appear. And they were very specific definitions because one of them was relating to how to take the CMO organization and automate it in such a way so that marketers didn't have to worry so much about putting the pipes together and could start thinking more about, from a strategic perspective, how to create a marketing funnel that their organization could work effectively. And then there was ad tech, and ad tech was everything related to the advertising side in terms of how to deliver advertising in a way that was both efficient as well as highly targeted. What we're seeing, and what we're going to continue to see in terms of looking at for local businesses and small businesses as well, is that the ad tech and the martech worlds are very quickly consolidating. And we're seeing engagements. For example, there's a company in Voca that was originally a very marketing technology-oriented company related to call intelligence. And what they've done that I thought was interesting, a lot of other companies are also doing this, is they've opened up their back-end systems to make it so that any information that's collected from the marketing platform or from the automation platform is now able to be, through an API or through some other technology, able to be sent to different organizations within the primary organization, whether it's sales, whether it's the ad groups, whether it's the trading desk. And what we're seeing is that this consolidation is going to make it so that we can now start to focus more on the high-level conversations of what do we do from a marketing 101 perspective with our client base or our customer base? What do we need to think about from an advertising perspective for our clients in terms of truly helping them on a consultative basis to know what their goals are, and less about this widget, this silo, that silo. And I think that's going to be an emerging trend as well going into the next year.
So finally, the on-demand economy enters phase 2. So phase 1 of the on-demand economy was very much defined by a lot of money pouring into the space, some very large successes, some early flameouts, and really the feeling early on that this is a model that can be applied to essentially any local service or vertical that you can think of. And we learned a few important lessons from phase 1, one of which being it's not necessarily transferable to all local service verticals. If you look at some of the success stories and some of the formulas, it's essentially taking what was previously a disaggregated source of supply, bringing it together, deploying it with clever matching algorithms, and if you look at what Uber has done, doing so with a source of supply that is somewhat interchangeable. Now, we have learned that that doesn't necessarily work in verticals where there's a great deal of variance and complexity with the supply. So, for example, home services. HomeJoy learned this lesson, that there's a great deal of complexity, and complexity leads to a lot of quality control issues and margin compression when you're talking about not necessarily sending interchangeable drivers, it's more about very specific levels of specialization and many different categories of that in the overall umbrella of home services. That was one lesson. Another important lesson was that leakage was a big problem for companies like HomeJoy, where after the first connection of buyer and seller, they go direct for every subsequent transaction, thus cutting out the on-demand provider or marketplace. And I think the important lesson there is to provide value that goes beyond just connecting buyer and seller, but that is sustainable for every subsequent transaction. And a few examples of that are what Uber does in terms of handling the payment processing seamlessly in the background. People love that. Airbnb creates a safe and secure place to transact. They hold money in escrow, they arbitrate disputes, they have a feedback system, some of these things that really justify the revenue share that they're getting. And I think that's an important lesson we took out of phase 1. There are, of course, many other lessons. That's just an example, but we're going to look forward to hearing a lot about this from a session that Mitch Ratcliffe is doing tomorrow at 11:15 with a lot of local on-demand players and leaders about what they've learned and what this is really going to look like going into the next era and the next year. So that's actually our last theme, and we're going to move on soon. But first, Abid, I want to give you the final word about, we covered a lot just now, but there are also, beyond just the individual sessions and macro themes, some other things that are arising that you were talking about yesterday that you're looking forward to seeing over the next day and kind of triangulating that.
Yeah.
So,
real quickly, and again, thank you so much for being here. This week, we're really excited. We've worked on this agenda for quite some time and making sure that it's not only strategic in terms of thinking, but also you can have some tactical elements to take away to your teams. BI Kelsey, in the last 6 months going forward, has been fully invested in this notion of the local commerce universe. And we would love to hear your thoughts on how your companies and your organizations are starting to position themselves in the framework of the local commerce universe. And Mike, myself, and the rest of the analyst team are going to be all around throughout the sessions. We would love to hear from you. And how many new attendees are there in the room tonight? I just want to make sure. Let's see here that I make sure I can see all of you. And I'm going to come and say hi to all of you now. But again, thank you so much. And Mike, I'm going to pass it back to you for the next session.
And before we move on to Facebook, a quick building on what you just said, you've heard Abid and myself mention a few times the local commerce universe. This is a new construct by which we're looking at this overall opportunity and packaging and delivering it to you. If you're interested in more about what that's all about, we're going to have a CEO address from our CEO, Tom Buno, today at 11:45, where he's going to really kind of drill down and explain and define what that's all about. So I recommend you attend that session. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Abid.